This was the scene in Houston, Texas last night where George Floyd grew up. People gathered to mark 2 years since his death and to see the unveiling of a statue called Conversation with George. It depicts Floyd seated at a table, and according to the artist, it's meant to welcome everyone of all races and ethnic backgrounds to have a seat and join him. George Floyd was a black man murdered by a white police officer. His death sparked protests and worldwide conversation about racial injustice. The book, His Name is George Floyd, reveals how systemic racism in the United States shaped George Floyd's life and legacy. Joining me now are the co-authors of the book, Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorunnipa, both with the Washington Post. Robert, walk us through the timeline of the book. You go way back before Floyd's life. Explain how it connects to the racial injustice that he experienced.
So our book starts with the history of George Floyd's great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart, who is the first person who was emancipated in the George Floyd bloodline. He was an industrious man who acquired 500 acres of land. But before he could make a single intergenerational transfer, which is how we build wealth in this country, that land was stolen from him, seized through fraud and unscrupulous tax deals. And that set the family on a course of poverty. Imagine a world in which he was able to inherit that wealth. It would have been a very different type of story for George Floyd and millions of other Black Americans.
Now, Toluse, from your interviews, you learned that Floyd had a real academic potential, but educational policies in Houston held him back. Can you explain how?
Yeah, that statue that you just showed had an essay in front of it. It was a second grade essay that George Floyd wrote when he was 8 years old, and he wrote about how he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. It was one of the assignments that he had in his second grade class, which happened to be in an underfunded, segregated school. But George Floyd stood out. We talked to his teacher, and she said that he was someone who was making all of his marks despite coming from an underfunded school and living in a segregated, impoverished community. And George Floyd had ambitions and dreams at that age. He was someone who focused on his studies and wanted to see himself excelling as a professional in the legal world. But unfortunately, as he continued to attend underfunded schools and as he continued to suffer in his community, which was impoverished and which was neglected by the government and which happened to be made up almost entirely of young Black people like him, he fell behind academically, and he ended up putting more of his focus into athletics, which is where people steered him to because they figured that would be the best way for him to make it out of his community. And we write about in the book about how that turned out really poorly for him.
Now, Robert, in all of your interviews and reporting, what's a personality trait or something about Floyd that's largely been ignored that you feel should be out there much more?
He was an introspective striver. And one of the things that we learned about through not just talking with people who knew George Floyd, but also looking at some of the things that he wrote, the raps he wrote, he talked about his sides. He talked about wanting to be seen in his fullness. He talked about how much he loved and wanted to be loved. And so when people go through the pages of this book, they'll see a George Floyd who they don't know and might not fully expect, because we don't expect a person who was his size 6'6", 225 pounds to have that kind of personality. But from all accounts, from everyone who knew him, they talked about him as being a gregarious, loving, thoughtful person.
Now, Toluse, your book also talks about Derek Chauvin, the police officer convicted in Floyd's death. Can you tell us some of the parallels in Floyd's and Chauvin's lives and some of the differences for Chauvin that allowed him to benefit from broader opportunities in life?
Well, we went back into Derek Chauvin's ancestry as well, and we found out that his ancestors came to the U.S. voluntarily on a ship, and they were able to build wealth rather rapidly, working first as farmers and then as tradesmen, and then building up a lifestyle that allowed them to enter into the middle class in this country, which George Floyd's family never got that chance. And then after Derek Chauvin came to the scene, he was not a very good student, as we saw, and talking to some of the people who knew him back then. He was not particularly a strong striver as a student, but he was able to get opportunities, and those opportunities opened doors for him to allow him to become a police officer, which ended up becoming one of his dreams. After he had a couple of other avenues closed on him, he decided to pursue law enforcement, and those doors opened to him, and he was able to achieve those dreams. And even though across the course of his career in law enforcement, there were several complaints against him, he was seen as someone who was a thumper, someone who was always overly aggressive, and a lot of the people in the community did not like the way he was acting as a police officer. He was never reprimanded. He never got any of the kind of tough punishment that George Floyd had when he made mistakes and when he was seen as not doing the right thing. Instead, Derek Chauvin was continued to operate as a police officer and continued to use those tactics all the way until he murdered George Floyd.
Now, Robert, of course, the death of Floyd sparked a worldwide protest and had a lot of people looking at the injustice, racial injustice in America. Do you feel America has made progress with combating racism in these 2 years since Floyd's death has become such a rallying cry?
We've seen the good and we've seen the drawback. We've seen at least 16 states, they've passed either no-knock warrants, bans, or bans on neck restrictions. And we've seen corporate America put in money toward efforts toward equality. But when we think about the roots of this issue, we think about the backlash, the books that were popular in 2020 that said everyone should read them, are now the same books that are banned in 2022. We see Joe Biden being able to pass only a limited version of the federal police reform that so many people said was badly needed. So one of the things we want to show is that this history is a living history. It breathes and it revolves around us, and it's not over yet. And we hope that people, after they go through the book, they have a better understanding of the past so they can make more informed decisions about the present when it comes to racial injustice.
Now, Tolu, Robert touched on it a little bit right there, but final question to you. What do you hope readers gain from the book?
Well, we do hope readers take away a sense of who George Floyd was. There's a lot of information about who he was as a child, who he was as an adolescent. It was much more than a 10-minute video. And we also hope people get a sense of who we are as a country and as a society, and make sure that, we do not leave people like George Floyd in the margins of our society, because there are millions of other people who are living as George Floyd lived. And it's important for us to acknowledge them, acknowledge their trials and tribulations and their dreams, and make sure that we are living in an equitable society that allows everyone to pursue those dreams equally.
Robert Samuels and Toluse Olorunnipa, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.